What if I told you that some Ontario towns have become so dangerous and economically devastated that even longtime residents are planning their escape routes? Number 10. Kapuskasing. The paper mill promise has turned into a living nightmare for families trapped in this northern Ontario town. Kapuskasing built its entire identity around the forestry industry, but that foundation is crumbling faster than anyone wants to admit. Here's the shocking reality that will make your skin crawl. Kapuskasing has one of the highest youth exodus rates in all of Ontario. Over 60% of high school graduates leave within 6 months of finishing school and never return. But here's what's truly terrifying. They're not just leaving for better opportunities, they're fleeing from a town that's literally dying around them. The Kapuskasing River, once the lifeblood of the community, now runs contaminated from decades of industrial waste. Residents have been dealing with water advisories and health warnings for years, but the local government keeps downplaying the severity. Families are afraid to let their children play near the water that their grandparents once swam in safely. The economic devastation is even worse than the environmental disaster. The town's main employer has reduced its workforce by 40% in the past 3 years, leaving hundreds of families scrambling to make mortgage payments on homes that are now worth less than what they owe. The downtown core looks like a post-apocalyptic movie set, with more boarded-up storefronts than operating businesses. But here's what makes living in Kapuskasing truly unbearable: the complete lack of basic services that most Ontarians take for granted. The nearest major hospital is over 2 hours away, meaning medical emergencies become life-or-death races against time. The internet infrastructure is so poor that working from home is nearly impossible, trapping residents in a town with no local job opportunities. Winter temperatures regularly drop below -40 degrees, and the heating costs alone can consume 30% of a family's income. Combined with the highest grocery prices in Northern Ontario due to transportation costs, many families are choosing between heating their homes and feeding their children. The isolation is psychological torture for anyone who's experienced life in a connected community, but what comes next on our list makes Kapuskasing look like a vacation destination. Number 9. Elliott Lake. The uranium ghost town that refuses to die is slowly poisoning everyone who stays. Elliott Lake was supposed to be the perfect retirement community, but it's become a death trap for seniors who can't afford to leave. Here's the bone-chilling truth that real estate agents will never tell you. Elliott Lake sits on contaminated soil from decades of uranium mining. The radioactive legacy isn't just buried in the ground, it's seeping into basements, contaminating well water, and creating health hazards that the government has been covering up for years. The town's infrastructure is collapsing at an alarming rate. Remember the Algo Center Mall collapse in 2012 that killed 2 people? That wasn't an isolated incident. It was a warning sign of what happens when a town can't afford to maintain its buildings. Residents live in constant fear that the next roof collapse could be their apartment building, their grocery store, or their community center. The healthcare situation is absolutely terrifying for a town marketed to seniors. The local hospital has reduced services so dramatically that it's basically a first aid station. Heart attacks, strokes, and serious injuries require helicopter evacuation to Sudbury, weather permitting. During winter storms, residents are completely cut off from emergency medical care. But here's what makes Elliott Lake truly nightmarish: the complete economic stagnation. There are no jobs for young people, no opportunities for growth, and no hope for improvement. The average age of residents is increasing by 1 year every year, creating a demographic time bomb where there won't be enough working-age people to support the aging population. The social isolation is devastating. Families watch their adult children move hundreds of kilometers away, leaving elderly parents alone in a town with declining services and increasing dangers. The suicide rate among seniors has quietly increased, though local officials rarely discuss these statistics publicly. Property values have collapsed so completely that homes can't be sold at any price. Seniors who moved here thinking they'd found affordable paradise are now trapped in a contaminated wasteland with no escape route. Their life savings are tied up in worthless real estate in a town that's slowly killing them. The crime rate has also spiked as desperate residents turn to illegal activities to survive. Drug trafficking has become a major problem, bringing violence and instability to a community that was supposed to be peaceful and safe. Number 8. Smooth Rock Falls. The Company Town catastrophe is unfolding in real time as residents watch their community die a slow, agonizing death. Smooth Rock Falls represents everything that can go wrong when a town puts all its economic eggs in one basket. Here's the nightmare scenario that's playing out right now. The town's main employer has announced permanent closure within 18 months. That single decision will eliminate 80% of the local jobs and turn Smooth Rock Falls into a ghost town virtually overnight. But here's the truly horrifying part. Most residents have no idea how they're going to survive. The housing market has already collapsed so completely that families can't sell their homes for enough money to pay off their mortgages. They're literally trapped in a town with no economic future, watching their neighbors pack up and abandon their houses rather than continue making payments on worthless property. The retail sector is imploding as families lose their income and stop spending money locally. The grocery store, gas station, and pharmacy are all facing closure, which would leave residents without basic necessities within driving distance. Imagine having to drive 2 hours just to buy food or fill a prescription. But the psychological impact is even more devastating than the economic destruction. This is a close-knit community where families have lived for generations, building their entire identities around local traditions and relationships. Watching that community dissolve is causing depression, anxiety, and family breakdowns that will scar survivors for decades. The municipal government is facing bankruptcy as the tax base evaporates. Essential services like snow removal, road maintenance, and garbage collection are being reduced or eliminated entirely. Residents are paying higher taxes for fewer services while watching their town literally fall apart around them. The educational system is collapsing as families with children flee the town. The local school is facing closure due to declining enrollment, which would force remaining families to either homeschool their children or move away. It's a vicious cycle that's accelerating the town's death spiral. Young people who grew up in Smooth Rock Falls are watching their childhood home disappear, knowing they can never return to the community that shaped them. The emotional trauma of losing your hometown is something most people never experience, but it's becoming a reality for hundreds of families. Number 7. Attawapiskat. The infrastructure nightmare that shocked Canada is still a daily reality for residents living in conditions that would be considered unacceptable in any developed nation. Attawapiskat isn't just one of the worst towns in Ontario. It's a humanitarian crisis that the government has failed to address for decades. Here's the shocking truth that will make you question everything you thought you knew about Canada. Attawapiskat residents live without clean drinking water, adequate housing, or basic sanitation systems that most Ontarians have taken for granted their entire lives. Children are growing up in overcrowded, moldy homes that are literally making them sick. The housing crisis is so severe that multiple families are forced to share single-family homes, creating dangerous overcrowding that leads to disease outbreaks and family conflicts. Many homes lack basic amenities like running water or functional heating systems, forcing residents to live in conditions that wouldn't be tolerated anywhere else in the province. The suicide rate among young people is absolutely heartbreaking. Teenagers are taking their own lives at rates that would trigger emergency interventions in any other community, but Attawapiskat's geographic isolation and systemic neglect mean that mental health resources are virtually non-existent. But here's what makes this situation truly enraging. Attawapiskat sits on mineral-rich land that generates millions of dollars in revenue for mining companies. Yet the community that hosts these operations lives in poverty that resembles conditions in developing nations. The contrast between corporate profits and community suffering is morally obscene. The education system is failing children who deserve the same opportunities as every other Ontario student. Schools lack basic supplies, qualified teachers, and adequate facilities, condemning another generation to limited opportunities and continued poverty. Access to healthcare is a constant crisis. Medical emergencies require expensive air transport to distant hospitals, and routine healthcare is provided by understaffed nursing stations that can't handle the community's needs. Preventable diseases and untreated conditions are common because adequate healthcare simply isn't available. The isolation is psychological torture for residents who want to access opportunities, services, or social connections available in other communities. The cost and difficulty of travel make it nearly impossible for most residents to leave, even temporarily. Government promises and funding announcements have become cruel jokes as conditions continue to deteriorate, despite decades of political attention and public outrage. Number 6. Walkerton. The water poisoning legacy continues to haunt this southwestern Ontario town, where residents still live in fear of the taps that once killed their neighbors. Walkerton's contaminated water crisis wasn't just a historical tragedy. It created ongoing trauma and systemic problems that make this one of Ontario's most difficult places to live. Here's the terrifying reality that outsiders don't understand. Many Walkerton residents still refuse to drink their tap water, even though officials claim it's safe. The psychological scars from watching friends and family members die from E. coli poisoning run so deep that bottled water has become a permanent household expense for families who can barely afford groceries. The economic devastation from the water crisis continues to ripple through the community. Tourism disappeared overnight and never recovered, leaving downtown businesses struggling to survive on a reduced local customer base. Property values plummeted and have never recovered, trapping families in homes they can't sell. But here's what makes living in Walkerton truly unbearable: the constant anxiety about whether the next glass of water might make you sick. Parents watch their children constantly, looking for signs of illness that might indicate another contamination event. This level of chronic stress is destroying families and communities from the inside out. The legal aftermath created a divided community where neighbors blamed each other for the crisis. Lawsuits and investigations tore apart relationships that had existed for generations, leaving behind a social fabric that's still torn and frayed decades later. Municipal services operate under a cloud of suspicion and fear. Every time there's a water main break or pressure drop, residents panic and stock up on bottled water. The town's infrastructure requires constant monitoring and maintenance that strains the municipal budget and keeps everyone on edge. The health impacts continue to affect survivors who developed chronic conditions from their exposure to contaminated water. Medical bills and ongoing treatments create financial hardships for families who are already struggling economically. Young families actively avoid moving to Walkerton because of its reputation, limiting population growth and economic development. The town is trapped in a cycle of decline that started with the water crisis and continues to this day. The media attention and government scrutiny that followed the crisis created a fishbowl environment where residents feel constantly watched and judged, adding to the psychological burden of living in a community defined by tragedy. Number 5. Thunder Bay. The murder capital of Canada disguises its violence behind scenic lakeshores and tourism marketing. But residents live in daily fear of becoming the next victim in a city where Indigenous people disappear and die at horrifying rates. Here's the blood-chilling statistic that officials try to bury. Thunder Bay has the highest murder rate in Canada, with Indigenous people being killed at rates that would trigger international human rights investigations if they occurred anywhere else in the world. The Kaministiquia River has become a graveyard where Indigenous bodies are found with suspicious regularity. The systemic racism is so embedded in local institutions that Indigenous families are afraid to report crimes or seek help from police who have demonstrated open hostility toward their community. Teenagers know they risk death simply by walking through certain neighborhoods, and parents live in constant terror that their children won't come home. But the violence extends beyond the Indigenous community into the broader population. Drug trafficking and gang activity have turned parts of Thunder Bay into war zones where gunshots and stabbings are regular occurrences. Families barricade themselves in their homes after dark, and children can't play outside without supervision. The economic inequality is staggering. While mining executives and government officials live in luxury, thousands of residents struggle with poverty, addiction, and homelessness that make daily survival a challenge. The contrast between wealth and poverty is visible on every street corner. The healthcare system is overwhelmed by violence-related injuries, overdoses, and mental health crises. Emergency rooms operate like battlefield hospitals, treating gunshot wounds and drug overdoses while lacking resources to address the underlying social problems creating these casualties. The education system is failing children who are traumatized by violence and family instability. Schools have become refuges where students seek safety from neighborhoods that have become increasingly dangerous. The judicial system has lost credibility in indigenous communities where suspicious deaths are routinely ruled accidental or suicide, despite evidence suggesting foul play. Families seeking justice for murdered relatives face institutional barriers and outright hostility. Property crime is epidemic as desperate residents resort to theft and break-ins to survive. Homeowners install security systems and guard dogs, but many families simply accept that they'll be victimized repeatedly. Number 4. Oshawa. The automotive apocalypse has turned this former boomtown into a drugs and despair wasteland, where families watch their neighborhoods transform into crime-ridden hellscapes. Oshawa's economic collapse has created social problems that make daily life dangerous and depressing. Here's the devastating reality that city officials won't acknowledge. Oshawa has become the fentanyl overdose capital of Ontario, with emergency responders making multiple overdose calls every single day. Parks where children once played are now shooting galleries where addicts collapse and die while families watch helplessly. The automotive plant closures didn't just eliminate jobs, they destroyed the social fabric that held communities together. Families who had stable middle-class incomes for generations are now struggling with poverty, addiction, and despair that's tearing apart relationships and communities. But here's what makes Oshawa truly terrifying to live in: the gang violence that has escalated as drug dealers fight for territory in a city with limited police resources. Shootings occur in broad daylight near schools and shopping centers, forcing parents to keep children indoors and plan routes that avoid known danger zones. The downtown core has become a post-apocalyptic wasteland of abandoned buildings, homeless encampments, and open drug use that makes basic errands like grocery shopping feel dangerous. Business owners have given up trying to maintain storefronts that are repeatedly vandalized and burglarized. The mental health crisis is overwhelming local resources as residents struggle with depression, anxiety, and trauma from watching their community disintegrate. Suicide rates have increased dramatically, particularly among middle-aged men who lost their automotive jobs and see no hope for recovery. Property crime is so common that residents have stopped reporting break-ins and theft because police response is slow and ineffective. Car theft rings operate openly, stealing vehicles that are shipped overseas or stripped for parts in broad daylight. The healthcare system is collapsing under the weight of overdoses, violence-related injuries, and mental health emergencies. Hospital emergency rooms are overcrowded with drug users, assault victims, and people in mental health crises who have nowhere else to turn. Schools are dealing with children who are traumatized by family addiction, violence, and poverty. Teachers have become social workers trying to address problems that extend far beyond education while lacking resources or training to handle these complex situations. Number 3. Sudbury. The toxic wasteland masquerading as a city slowly poisons everyone who breathes its contaminated air, while economic devastation turns neighborhoods into crime-infested zones where families fear for their safety. Sudbury's environmental and social problems have created living conditions that border on uninhabitable. Here's the horrifying truth that health officials downplay. Sudbury's air quality is so contaminated by decades of mining pollution that residents have significantly higher rates of cancer, respiratory disease, and birth defects than anywhere else in Ontario. Children are literally being poisoned by the air they breathe every day. The soil contamination is so severe that growing food gardens is dangerous, Yet many families can't afford to buy all their groceries due to economic hardship. Parents face impossible choices between feeding their children contaminated homegrown food or struggling to afford safe groceries on unemployment benefits. But the environmental disaster is just the beginning of Sudbury's problems. The collapse of the mining industry has created mass unemployment that's turned formerly stable neighborhoods into crime zones where break-ins, drug dealing, and violence are daily occurrences. The addiction crisis has reached epidemic proportions as desperate residents turn to drugs and alcohol to cope with unemployment, health problems, and hopelessness. Emergency rooms are overwhelmed with overdoses, while treatment resources remain inadequate for the scale of the problem. The infrastructure is literally crumbling from decades of neglect and environmental damage. Roads are full of potholes that destroy vehicles, water systems are contaminated by industrial runoff, and buildings are deteriorating from acid rain and pollution exposure. The economic inequality is stark and growing. While mining executives and government officials maintain comfortable lifestyles, thousands of families struggle with poverty that makes basic necessities like heating and food luxuries they can't afford. The healthcare system is failing residents who need specialized treatment for pollution-related illnesses. Cancer rates are high, but oncology services are limited, forcing sick residents to travel hundreds of kilometers for treatment they may not be able to afford. The educational system is underfunded and overwhelmed by children dealing with health problems, family instability, and economic stress. Schools lack resources to address the complex needs of students whose families are struggling with multiple crises simultaneously. The social fabric is disintegrating as families leave in search of healthier environments and better opportunities. Those who remain are often trapped by poverty, illness, or family obligations in a city that's slowly killing them. Number 2. Windsor. The border city has become a smuggling corridor where drug cartels and human traffickers operate freely, while residents live in fear of becoming collateral damage in conflicts that spill across international boundaries. Windsor's proximity to Detroit has turned it into a crime haven that rivals the most dangerous American cities. Here's the terrifying reality that tourism boards try to hide. Windsor has become a major entry point for fentanyl, cocaine, and human trafficking operations that bring violence and corruption to neighborhoods throughout the city. Gang wars between rival trafficking organizations have turned residential areas into battlegrounds where innocent families are caught in crossfire. The border location that once seemed like an economic advantage has become a curse as criminal organizations exploit the constant flow of people and goods between Canada and the United States. Law enforcement is overwhelmed by sophisticated criminal operations that have more resources and better equipment than local police forces. But here's what makes Windsor truly dangerous: the normalization of violence that occurs when criminal activity becomes so common that residents accept gunshots and drug deals as part of daily life. Children grow up thinking that gang activity and police raids are normal neighborhood events. The addiction crisis has reached catastrophic levels as cheap, high-purity drugs flood the streets through smuggling operations. Overdose deaths occur daily, and emergency responders are overwhelmed by calls to revive people who have collapsed from fentanyl poisoning. The economic devastation from automotive industry decline has created desperate populations that criminal organizations exploit for recruitment and operations. Unemployed residents with few legal options are drawn into illegal activities that put entire communities at risk. The corruption has infected local institutions as criminal organizations use bribes and intimidation to compromise officials who should be protecting residents. The line between legitimate business and criminal enterprise has become blurred in sectors like transportation, construction, and hospitality. Property crime is epidemic as addicts steal anything valuable to fund their drug habits while gang members extort businesses and intimidate residents who might cooperate with law enforcement. Many neighborhoods have become no-go zones after dark. The healthcare system is overwhelmed by violence-related injuries, overdoses, and trauma cases while lacking resources to address the underlying social problems creating these medical emergencies. Emergency rooms operate like war zone hospitals, treating casualties from an ongoing conflict. Number 1. Sault Ste. Marie. The dying steel town has become a nightmare of economic collapse, environmental poisoning, and social breakdown that makes daily survival a struggle for families trapped in Canada's most hopeless community. Sault Ste. Marie represents the complete failure of industrial policy and urban planning. Here's the apocalyptic reality that makes Sault Ste. Marie the worst place to live in Ontario. The city is simultaneously dying economically while being poisoned environmentally, creating a perfect storm of problems that make basic human needs like employment, healthcare, and clean air impossible to obtain. The steel industry collapse has eliminated thousands of high-paying jobs while leaving behind contaminated land, poisoned water, and air pollution that continues to sicken residents years after the plant's reduced operations. Families are trapped between unemployment and environmental poisoning with no escape route. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. The city's geographic isolation means that when the steel industry dies completely, there will be nothing to replace it. Residents are watching their community enter a death spiral with no hope of recovery or revival. The healthcare crisis is catastrophic for a community dealing with high rates of cancer, respiratory disease, and industrial injuries. The local hospital has reduced services repeatedly while demand increases from residents sickened by environmental contamination and stressed by economic hardship. The addiction and mental health crisis has reached epidemic proportions as residents cope with unemployment, illness, and hopelessness through drugs and alcohol. Suicide rates have increased dramatically, particularly among middle-aged men who built their identities around steel industry employment. The infrastructure is collapsing faster than the city can afford to repair it. Roads are impassable, water systems are contaminated, and buildings are deteriorating from both environmental damage and municipal neglect due to budget constraints. The social fabric has disintegrated as families flee in search of opportunities elsewhere, leaving behind a declining population of elderly residents and people too poor or sick to relocate. Community organizations are closing, schools are consolidating, and social connections are disappearing. The economic inequality is stark between remaining steel industry executives and workers who have lost everything. The contrast between corporate profits and community suffering has created anger and resentment that divides neighbors and destroys social cohesion. The environmental legacy of industrial operations will continue poisoning residents for generations, even if economic conditions improve. The soil, water, and air contamination represents a permanent toxic burden that affects every aspect of daily life. The complete lack of economic diversification means that recovery is virtually impossible without massive government intervention that shows no signs of materializing. Residents are trapped in a community with no future and no hope. These 10 communities represent the failure of industrial policy, environmental protection, and social services that have abandoned hundreds of thousands of Ontarians to suffer in conditions that should not exist in a developed nation. If you're considering moving to Ontario or currently live in one of these communities, share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what you think needs to change to address these crises. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more investigations into the communities and issues that mainstream media won't cover honestly.